Hi, so first, thanks a lot for this opportunity to allow me to speak to all of you. Once again, I apologize for not being able to make it there in person due to some fieldwork issues. So I'm actually part of the economics faculty here at LUMS, Lahore University of Management Sciences. And here I teach a class particularly on water economics, and I also have several other data-driven and empirical research projects which basically look at the relationship between groundwater depletion and its impacts on the economy, particularly on the agriculture sector, as well as potential impacts on other sectors such as manufacturing, as well as small-scale enterprises, etc. So as you may have guessed from the title of my talk, which is Pricing the Blue Gold, I'm actually going to talk to you today about the importance of water pricing, why we need to think about this, and how we sort of need to go about it, and where this discussion should essentially be going. You may have already seen quite a bit of debate on this as well as discussions around it lately, but I'm going to give you sort of the pure economist perspective today, and in particular, how do economists deal with this and what kind of theory is sort of out there and what's the evidence suggesting from different parts of the world, etc. Particularly in that context, I've divided my talk into three parts today. So first, just to tell you, I'm going to talk about what the economic motivation behind water pricing is and why should we think about water pricing at all. So first, I'll talk a bit about that. Then I'm going to talk more about some of the key methods of water pricing and what their associated pros and cons are related to each method, and what are the different factors that you need to consider when you're thinking of pricing water or when you're thinking of making water pricing policies. What's the infrastructure that you need in place, etc. Okay. And finally, after that, I'm going to also talk a little bit about the key lessons as well as the way forward that you can sort of take away from this talk today. So just to get you started, I want you to take a minute to sort of imagine you're in your kitchen, maybe washing some dishes under running water, or you're out in your own garage washing your car or have someone washing it, or you're a particular farmer in a field where you're using flood irrigation to water your crops. So you could sort of be in any one of those situations. So just imagine while you're there and you're using water, and once you've gotten done with this, you now see an advertisement on television, which is basically asking you to conserve water and, telling you about the importance of conserving water, particularly in relation to how the economy is moving, etc. The question for you to think about is, or what comes to your mind is, how can you change your behavior? And even more importantly, why should you change your behavior? What is your incentive to change or alter your behavior, particularly in relation to, this kind of water consumption? Now, obviously, in some of the cases, changing behavior does not involve a lot of monetary cost, but in a lot of cases, it actually does involve a significant monetary cost. Even in cases where monetary cost is actually not that high, behavioral change can entail significant time cost. So, for example, if you're being asked to do something, it may involve you taking time away from some other activity. So in terms of economics, that's kind of your opportunity cost. So, you're taking time away from work or you're taking time away from other things that you wanted to do to conserve water. Sure, but why should you be doing this? What is your incentive to, in a sense, do this? And then suppose there's some technology out there which can help you sort of adapt or which can help you sort of change your behavior. So let's take one example of a particular technology which can, change the volume of water that flows through your, pipes or your taps and, controls the flow of that water and helps you conserve water. Maybe you can put a little constrictor around it, but that constrictor perhaps costs you something. But if you don't use that constrictor, your cost is still not going to change as much. But if you do adopt that constrictor, you have to invest in a technology. But what you pay for your water in terms of your dues is not actually going to change as much, even if you adopt that constrictor. So the question for you then is that if water is not being priced, or if your costs or your dues are not changing as a result of the adoption of this technology, then why should you adopt this technology in the first place? Okay. Now the point is that, again, in this case, now you have no incentive to invest in that technology until and unless it would bring significant cost savings in terms of your water use. Similarly, there's a lot of debate around farmer water use, right? And so think of yourself as a farmer who's potentially, growing some crops and, your fields, and you're applying water using the traditional flood irrigation method. And, suddenly you're being asked to move towards drip irrigation. The question is, why should you move, right? As a farmer, you only care about two things. One, you care about your income, which you get, right? Which is going to depend on your productivity, and then it's going to depend on your costs. Now, because the pricing is so low, or the pricing does not vary as much, or the pricing structure is such that even if you invest in drip irrigation technology, one, it's not going to boost your productivity, because your productivity in terms of your yield is still going to be the same. And at the same time, it's not going to reduce your cost. If anything, it's going to significantly increase your cost, because drip irrigation is a fairly expensive technology. So then the question is, why should a farmer invest in drip irrigation at all? What incentive is there for a particular farmer to invest in drip irrigation? And this is a question I always, pose to my students in class as well, because when I talk about water conservation, the first sort of, answer that I get is, especially related to agriculture, is invest in drip irrigation. But the point is, why should a particular farmer invest in drip irrigation? And you may know this or not, but, in parts of the world where drip irrigation has been sort of adopted, it has been in cases where it was very heavily subsidized by the government, and so, or either, by some kind of other organizations, it was heavily subsidized. And even in those cases, the take-up is not that high. So the key challenge here is, until and unless you start pricing water, or you start, changing the value of water to people are not going to adopt technology which will help conserve water. Right? Okay. So my point, again, as I would just want to reiterate, is that incentives are really the key here. So if you don't align incentives, right, you cannot expect behavioral changes. Right? Now, there's some literature on non-price incentives, such as informational campaigns or awareness campaigns, a lot of which you've seen probably on television or, through other areas as well. But the literature from economics and different experiments actually suggest that non-price incentives, or these kind of nudges, they only work in cases when they are coupled with price incentives, and not so much in cases where they are just provided as standalone non-price incentives. So again, these informational campaigns, awareness campaigns, they are great, but they only work when they are complemented with price incentives and not just standalone by themselves. So again, it's important to sort of keep in mind that pricing incentives are really, again, as literature suggests, as economic theory suggests, pricing incentives are really the key here. Okay, so that's just to kind of get you a bit motivated on why we should, what's the sort of economic rationale behind thinking of water pricing at all. Now, next, I just want to talk a little bit about what water price is and how is it defined around the world. Right? So water price, not just in Pakistan, but also in other parts of the world, is currently priced or defined as cost of delivery. And cost of delivery has two components to it. The first component of cost of delivery is the fixed cost component. And the fixed cost component basically consists of building the infrastructure, which is for storing water, such as dams and reservoirs, and then also laying down the pipe networks for delivery from the source to the household itself. So this, this entire system consists of the infrastructure which is there to deliver water. Right? So that's kind of the fixed part of the cost of delivery, the cost of delivery structure. Right? The second is there's also a variable part to this cost of delivery structure, and the variable part basically consists of, the maintenance. So if you have a filtration plant in the middle of, the storage and the household, then some kind of water cleaning technology in the middle. So then there's also the different, staff that needs to be hired to make sure that water is being provided on time, etc., etc., or also to, sort of collect fees, etc. So that whole structure, that's kind of the variable component of the cost of delivery. So both these components, the fixed and the variable, they basically make up the cost of delivery cost structure. Okay. And finally, the third and the most important component of water pricing, which is almost never actually priced, is the actual value of water itself. Right? And in almost all cases, in Pakistan, but also in other parts of the world, not in all parts of the world, but in some parts of the world, this component is still considered zero, right? So unbelievable, right? Because here we are talking about water pricing, and at the same time, the actual value of water is not being considered, right? So imagine a different scenario. Let's forget about water for a minute. Imagine you order something from Amazon or Daraz, like a cell phone or anything else, like any kind of good or any kind of service, and all you pay for is the delivery fee and nothing else. Would that be acceptable? No, that would not be acceptable in any other case at all. Right? And yet here we are discussing one of the most important resources, and we are not pricing water at its value. Right? And we've been doing this for a long time. And when I say we, I'm not just talking about Pakistan. This is also the case in several other parts of the world. Similarly, think of scarcity as a concept. Right? If the supply of something cuts short or reduces, the market immediately responds and the prices begin to go up. Right? So imagine agricultural markets or vegetable markets or any other food markets. If the supply is cut for whatever reasons, maybe there's some kind of a weather shock or some other kind of shock which has impacted the supply of something, the prices immediately go up. In case of water, again, we don't have anything like that happening because your price is your cost of delivery, which does not change with the supply. The part of the water price, which is the true value, it's the actual value or the cost of the water itself or the price of the water itself, is just not being put into the pricing. Hence, the prices actually don't change when the supply changes, increases or decreases, either way. Right? So this means that your pricing is also not reflecting the scarcity value. Right? So if water supply is increasing or decreasing, or whatever is happening to it, your prices are actually not going to change at all. Right? Again, unbelievable and surprising, given that we are talking about a resource which is of such utmost importance, and we are discussing it and debating it so widely, but at the same time, we are not actually pricing it the right way. Okay. So now that I hope that, with some of these arguments, I have, somewhat convinced you on why we need to price water, I'm now going to come a little bit towards what are the different ways to price water, right? The first one, which is also sort of the most popular, is flat rate pricing, right? So flat rate pricing means that everyone pays a specific flat amount, irrespective of how much water they're actually consuming or using. Now, this is very convenient for contexts where metering is low or meters are not very sophisticated. So, as long as people live in a certain area, which is in the catchment of service area of a particular utility, or, people have a particular connection, then they have to pay a specific flat rate, irrespective of how much they're consuming. Now, like I said, this is very convenient. It's low cost in the sense that you don't need too much of an infrastructure to do this, but at the same time, it allows you to, do some kind of pricing, which is better than nothing. But again, the key problem here is that because the rate is flat, right, you just pay a flat fee, you cannot actually use this a lot to change consumption, because no matter what the flat rate is, higher or lower, you're always going to be paying the same amount no matter how much water you're consuming. Okay, so this kind of structure seems to work well in particular scenarios, but at the same time, it does not really help you curb consumption or use pricing as a tool to curb consumption. Okay, so like I said, it's popular. At the same time, it's low cost in terms of the infrastructure and technology needs, but obviously it's problematic because it does not, let you control or discourage or encourage consumption by changing the pricing. The second method that I want to talk about to you is, as opposed to the flat rate, it's the volumetric pricing. So volumetric pricing is the case where your price is sensitive to consumption or price changes as your consumption changes. Now, this pricing usually involves some kind of fixed charge and then some kind of variable per unit of consumption charge. Now, the variable per unit pricing basically involves making, certain blocks of consumption. So, saying, okay, if consumption is between X and Y, then I'm going to charge this much per unit. If the consumption is between Y and Z, then each additional unit is going to be sort of charged on this amount. And if consumption is even more than that, then you're going to charge any additional units in that third block. So you have these different kind of tariff blocks in which consumption can fall. Okay. Within these methods, then, further you have sort of three sub-methods, you can say. There's the increasing block rate, in which, as consumption increases, the per unit price increases. Then you have the decreasing block rate, in which as the consumption increases, the per unit cost begins to decrease. And finally, you also have the uniform block rates, which basically price the per unit cost at the same amount everywhere. This is different from flat rate, because in flat rate you actually don't you don't really charge a per unit price at all. So uniform block rate is like a uniform per unit price. So you're charged a certain amount per unit, but it's the same as your consumption increases at every point in the price curve. Okay, so these are basically sort of the three popular methods out there. Now, obviously, increasing block rate seems to be the most popular in terms of curbing consumption, because as consumption increases, you tend to charge higher price per unit. So that sets the incentives right in terms of you basically curbing consumption. Okay. Yeah, so those are basically some of the methods which are kind of out there. Now, obviously, when we speak of water pricing, another thing which is very important that comes to mind, especially in a developing country like Pakistan, is issue of equity concerns. Right? So yes, there are equity concerns, but then there are also some more sophisticated pricing methods involving adjusting for household size when constructing price blocks. Right? So what it means is that if you have a smaller household, if you have fewer people per household, then the width of the block in which your lower pricing units fall is going to be narrower compared to if you have a larger household. So essentially, then you're charging people per capita or per person in the household instead of charging them as an entire household. Now, obviously, that requires a lot more information. It requires a much more sophisticated meter as well. It requires a much more sophisticated data collection, and so on. But, that can be done. So that's one way to address this kind of issue of, larger households versus smaller households. Similarly, you can also have a system where a certain amount of water is just provided for free, and the rest is then, priced at a certain block, because obviously there are equity concerns in terms of the lower income households being able to afford it and so on. And now, again, this is very useful for low income households as well. And another model which is out there is that for low income households, to address equity concerns, what some places have done is that they actually use the collected revenues in pricing to redistribute back to the lower income households. And so as a result, you can use the pricing incentive to curb consumption, and then whatever revenues you collect can basically be redistributed or reinvested back into the people. So that's kind of another perspective to it, and that helps to balance things out in terms of the equity. Now, there are also several other ways to do this, and in general, water pricing does not mean that you're actually compromising on equity in any way at all. So there are ways to deal with it. So the argument which we often hear about water pricing is this sense of water pricing compromising equity is actually not a very valid one, and the economics literature has shown that there are models out there, such as the redistribution one, such as the pricing at per capita instead of per household, etc., which can really help you kind of build this into a much more equitable model. But the point and the key takeaway here, particularly for policymakers, is who are trying to find methods of water pricing, or who are trying to implement this, or who are trying to think, whether they want to price water or not, they have to keep two things in mind. One, they want to keep in mind what type of technology is available to them in terms of the metering, in terms of the staff availability, in terms of being able to generate bills in a monthly way, in a quarterly way, in an annual way, etc., etc. What is the technology and what is the capacity that you have? So you have to keep that in mind. Then you also have to keep in mind what is your goal in terms of setting conservation incentives. And the goals, as well as the technology, don't have to be the same everywhere in the country. So it could be that in certain, densely populated areas, you may want to use one method, while in sort of the more remote, less populated areas, you want to use a sort of a different method. So, there's no really one size one method fits all kind of an approach which is out there. So you have to keep both these factors in mind while deciding what type of or what kind of pricing method you want to implement. But you also have to keep in mind that to implement any of these methods or to move towards water pricing at all, you have to start somewhere. Right? So you have to start by metering, first of all. You have to start by metering connections. You have to think of what type of technology you can implement. Maybe a more expensive meter is not feasible initially, so you want to go with sort of a low cost one. And then, hence you can sort of base your pricing. So it is also going to depend on that, because the capacity of the meter or the ability to generate data, to get data to the utility company, etc., is really going to sort of determine how water is going to be priced. The second important step for policymakers is also to, sort of have this resolve and motivation to price water. You have to sort of move away from this notion that pricing water is somehow going to compromise equity, and, have this kind of motivation that, okay, we have to price water in all possible areas, not just for urban households, but also in context of agriculture and industry, etc. Now, finally, the third important thing is that consumers of all types also need to start realizing the importance of water pricing. So like I gave you the example, if you ordered something else through the Raz or Amazon and you received the product and you just paid the delivery fee, that would not be acceptable anywhere else. So why treat water to be very different? Obviously, water has some different characteristics and features, and it's an important need, etc. But at the same time, you have to really start valuing water as a sort of precious resource, and hence coming back to the title of my talk of the blue gold. This can bring potentials in terms of potential quality improvement, service improvement, supply improvement, etc., etc. So once again, thanks a lot for listening to me, and I again apologize for not being able to be there in person. My email is going to be displayed on the slide, so you can reach me if you have any sort of follow-up questions, or if there's anything you would in particular like to discuss. And I hope you all have a very productive and engaging conference. Have a nice day.